Hi, Dr. Hashmi. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
It is my pleasure. I can't wait to hear your presentation. Dr. Hashmi, I know that you're board certified in obesity medicine. Now, that's a specialty that I'm not really familiar with. What is it that you do exactly?
Obesity medicine is a really rapidly emerging field. And one of the biggest things that we know about obesity medicine is the core principles are that it focuses on lifestyle medicine. It focuses on people who are at a point where they're critically needing surgery. So things like bariatric surgery, how to take care of those patients, prepare them pre, take care of them after for complications post, and also take care of any deficiencies in vitamins that they may have. So part of what obesity medicine does is it creates a scientific rigor around the field of dealing with weight and how do we kind of come around that. And as not only just as a field, but as an organization and as a society, what can we do to start tackling this really significant issue?
Is it a relatively new field? Because my grandfather graduated medical school in the early 1900s, and I don't recall that being a specialty of medicine.
It is. As obesity continues to increase, it's caused there to be a lot more rigorous research to be there. There's a need for specialists to be available that know the intricacies of how the hormonal pathways work, what are the drug interactions. As more and more people require medication treatments for things, some of the side effects can be weight gain. There are certain medications that can help with weight loss. When are they safe to use? What are the consequences and risks that we need to be aware of?
It seems almost like with ever-growing number of people that are overweight or obese, I heard upwards of 70%. It seems like almost every doctor needs to be an obesity specialist.
And that's absolutely correct, because 2/3 of the population at large is either overweight or obese. So when you think about that number, it's so significant that every doctor should have education in nutrition, should have education in understanding what are the big sort of 3 markers for obesity. And a lot of that has to do with the lifestyle that we talk about, diabetes that we talk about. There's very basic things that we can do that can help people. But my approach to obesity is a little bit different than most physicians. I don't focus on weight, even though I'm an obesity specialist, and that's what I'm designed to do. I believe that if you focus on health, the weight will follow. If you focus just on losing weight, we can have somebody starve, so we can staple their mouth shut and they can't eat anything, and yes, they will lose weight. But weight loss will not equate to health. Getting healthy will equate to weight loss. So it's one of those things is if we know what our core beliefs are and we go and follow our true north, the rest will just follow. And that's my philosophy when it comes to weight. And what I wanted to share with you today is really what my research is all about, which is a PowerPoint I want to share with you guys that goes through what is the evidence on eating healthy. And remember, if you follow what's going to be presented today, it's going to lead you down the road of losing weight. So we don't start with the objective of losing weight. We start with the objective of getting healthy. And if you follow that objective, you will find that the outcome is not only health, but it's also weight loss.
I can't wait to see it.
All right, so let me switch screens, and I'm going to turn my head a little bit, so I apologize to my audience who's out there, but I'm going to share with you guys a little bit about the work that I do. And this is basically thousands and thousands of studies that I end up reading and reviewing and presenting. And this is the best of the last 6 years of data that I've gathered. So with that, I just want to double check you guys can see my screen. Quick okay on that. All right. So let's get started. So the talk is really, what is the scientific approach? Because as you know, in the world of nutrition, there's a lot of folks who say, they're experts. And what I want you guys to know right now is I'm not an expert. My job is to look at the data, is to be very critical of the data and to find out where is the evidence there. So in science, what we look at is the fact that it's very hard to have an absolute yes and an absolute no. And the more studies we get, the more we start to get consensus around the right approach. So today we're going to talk about what is that scientific approach to really understanding obesity, understanding nutrition, but it starts with health. So with that, I love this quote, which is by choosing healthy over skinny, you're choosing self-love over self-judgment. And I was grateful for you guys for having me on last time to talk about kidney disease. And what I had talked about was the self principle: sleep, exercise, love, and food. So I feel that when we talk about weight loss, it's really how do we take care of ourselves? And part of taking care of ourselves is self love, which is an incredibly important concept. It is so easy to be judgmental, and we are our strongest and worst critics. So what I hope that you guys get out of this is not how to lose weight, is how to learn to love yourself and how to learn to care for yourself. And if you focus on health, the weight will be there for you. And what's fascinating about nutrition, since I do a lot of research into nutrition, is there was a really interesting study, and what they were asking was, what is more complicated? Is it harder to do your own taxes, or is it harder to pick the perfect diet? And people said it's way harder to pick the perfect diet because there's so much information. We don't have a lack of information. We just have so much information that it becomes confusing. In fact, you could take any name on this slide and put one name with another name, and you would get a brand new diet that probably exists, and there's people practicing. So as I talk about nutrition and weight loss and health, I'm the anti-diet guy, because diet is this ugly word where it's die plus the letter T. So instead of talking about what's going to happen and how we're going to die, let's talk about how we're going to live and how we're going to contribute to the world. And when you think about food, what's fascinating to me about food is not about weight loss. Food is culture. Food incorporates some of the most beautiful memories that we have of our childhood, the things that we share with our loved ones. All of these amazing things that come up are all because we sat down and we shared food. So in realizing what foods will help us to feel better, feel energized, do good things, will help us to give this world a little bit more of ourselves, to be grateful for what we have and change things. So with that, I want to share with you really what you want to take home. And it's going to be divided in 3 sections, which is green light, yellow light, and red light. I'm not going to come and say you absolutely cannot have something, but I will tell you the way you look at this is, if you look at the green light foods and you say, what are the most important things I should do? It's the green light. Focus on the green light. Eat more of that as much as you can. That's your foundation. If you absolutely want to go beyond that, there's yellow light. And the red light is really where we have strong data to say, that's where there is harm to be had. So green light, great for you. Red light, you really want to think about minimizing. Yellow light is where there's data that kind of creates controversy a little bit. And there's positives and negatives, and I'll share with that in an unbiased fashion so you guys get to see what's the data showing. So with green light, it's really straightforward, right? It's the stuff that we say is like the best stuff on earth, right? I'm going to use a brand name, but there's a commercial for Snapple that says Snapple is the best stuff on earth. I say, no, the best stuff on earth is whole grains, fruits and vegetables, legumes, nuts, and seeds. So what do we know about whole grains? What's fascinating is whole grains have an impact on just about everything. In other words, they lower your risk of dying from just about anything. If you look at heart disease, there's a 14% reduction. Even cancer is reduced. And if you talk about weight loss, what we have shown in some very elegant studies is that people who eat whole grains versus refined grains, whole grains will actually lose weight. And the reason is very simple. If you were to measure their stool, and the way you measure it is you collect the stool and you burn it. Now remember, this is where all sorts of students who are trying to go into medical school, they become interns, and some intern had to do this study. So when they burn the stool, what they find is that people who eat whole grains, they have a lot more energy in that stool. That means a lot less energy went inside their body. And that's why whole grains versus refined grains is so beautiful. Fruits and vegetables, what's fascinating is if you eat more fresh fruits and vegetables daily, and we're not talking about organic versus non-organic, we're just saying fruits and vegetables right now. So if you eat more fruits and vegetables, you'll find the blood pressure goes down. 4 millimeters is about the equivalent of half a blood pressure pill. What about sugars? People are worried that if they eat fruits, their sugars will go higher. That's not true. If you drink fruit juice, yes, but fruits are wonderful. And if you eat whole fruits, you're going to have beautiful benefits and your sugars will actually go down and your risk of becoming a diabetic will go down by as much as 12%. What about brain health? So if you start to eat more vegetables, and it doesn't take much, even if you add an extra serving. So in this study where they had people who ate about a serving and a half to really hardly any serving at all of green leafy vegetables, what they found on memory tests was that their brain level was almost a difference of 11 years of age. So in other words, it's like gaining extra years or reversing the clock a little bit in that your brain capacity to be able to problem solve, think, do things, remember things, all of that gets better with simply eating more fruits and vegetables. Even if you talk about cancer, simple things like your green and yellow vegetables, your cruciferous vegetables, right? Things like kale is king, broccoli, cabbage, all of those things will lower your risk of cancer. And if you can add a serving of fruits and vegetables to every single one of your meals, you'll find that you have a 14% reduction in your risk of dying from cancer. That still is significant. And then legumes, right? So my favorite stuff is legumes. What happens? If you eat some beans every day, your risk of dying goes down by 16%. Nuts are awesome. Just a simple handful of nuts. That's all you need. And it doesn't matter what kind of nuts they are as long as they are unsalted. They don't need to be like honey coated or all sorts of craziness. Just get some nuts and eat them. You see a beautiful reduction in your risk of dying. So all cause goes down. Cardiovascular goes down by a whopping 27%. Let's look at cancer and nuts. What happens? Colorectal, 24% reduction. Endometrial, 42% reduction. Pancreatic, 32% reduction. Even the risk of dying from anything goes down by 14%. So bottom line, take a handful of nuts and eat them every day. That's it. That's literally all you have to do. Seeds are really interesting. You know, I have a kale smoothie that I make every day, and in it I always put 2 tablespoons of ground flaxseed in there because the data on flaxseed, chia seeds is so powerful. Not only does it affect weight, it affects things like sugar. It improves your cholesterol. It improves your A1C. It's beautiful the impact that flax seeds can have simply by just adding it into your diet. And if you get it in ground form, you can sprinkle it onto your food and just go to town. Even for things like blood pressure, 30 grams a day, which is not a whole lot, just 30 grams a day, you're looking at the equivalent of 1 blood pressure medication's effect. So your blood pressure goes down by about 10 points. That's huge if you think about how powerful foods are. So that's your green light. That's what you start with. That's what you focus on. But what about yellow light? Now, yellow light is things like chicken, dairy, oils, eggs, alcohol. So what's the data? Let's start with chicken, right? So what we know is everybody focuses on red meat and the dangers of red meat. But what's fascinating is red meat consumption has been really going down since the 70s. What's been going up all the way going back to 1940 till now is chicken. Chicken, 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 and chicken. And if you look at some of the research and you realize, you know, there's all these labeling gimmicks that they do in terms of no hormones and all that stuff. The problem is to get the baby chicks, they only come from 4 major factories and they control everything. They control the feed, they control the supply of chickens. So they breed them in a manner that they're designed to grow very, very large. In fact, they grow so large that they get hip fractures and they cannot move. And they end up having heart attacks. And those are the kinds of chicken that people are eating. So when they talk about things like free range, a chicken cannot move if they can't even stand because their weight is so high and they're getting fractures and they're stuck. And if you watch the movie Super Size Me 2, which is a fascinating film in terms of the horrors of what goes on here, it's quite eye-opening. And it makes us realize how much of a responsibility we have to this world. So when it comes to chicken consumption, it's way more now. And as a result, the total amount of meat that Americans eat is way more now than before. But it's not because of red meat, and it's really not because of pork. It has to do with chicken. So some of the data on chicken is interesting. When they looked at things like stroke, they found that really there wasn't any kind of association with stroke or increased risk of cancer. But take a look at which populations they were looking at. the populations they were looking at, a lot of them were European. A lot of European data ends up being a little bit better than American data. And the reason is in Europe, their lives have a lot better sleep. They move a lot more than we do. Their social networks are better than ours. And their diets, even though some portions are relatively worse than ours, the fact that they do all of these other things actually gives them an edge over us. Our lives in America are incredibly stressful. In fact, there's that concept of hedonic adaptation where we're always looking for the next best thing and the next best thing. We don't get satisfied because all we're focusing on is material stuff. And this concept of being able to meditate and being able to get that inner peace allows us to get off this hedonic treadmill, so to speak, where you're just on it. And no matter what you get, you always want the next best thing. And that creates incredible amounts of stress for us. So let's look at some negatives around chicken. And what do we find? So in some of the population data, there's correlations specifically with pancreatic cancer. There's correlations with higher risk of high blood pressure. How about dairy? Another incredibly controversial thing. Why? Because when you start to look at dairy, the issue is in order for cows to produce milk, they have to be pregnant. So they make the cows pregnant all the time, and they're basically stuck in one place. It's incredibly inhumane to see how the dairy industry works. But the dairy industry also lobbies back, and they're able to fight back very strongly. And what they're able to do then is to change things like soy milk to soy beverage, which in my mind just creates all sorts of confusion for people. But you can call soy milk, and I don't think there's any issues in terms of doing that, but that's not the correct term anymore. It has to be quote unquote soy beverage. So what you find on dairy is in kidney disease with low-fat dairy, there's a reduction in the incidence of getting chronic kidney disease. But remember, in kidney disease, what we talked about was dairy, which is really high in phosphorus, is actually bad for kidney health. Then let's look at some of the negative side. And what do we find? We find that there's a much higher risk for things like Parkinson's disease on people who consume higher amounts of dairy. Don't know if that has to do with IGF-1. Don't know if that has to do with some of the other things. But remember, with cow's milk has about greater than 50 different hormones in there because they're designed for the baby calf to be able to grow. They're not designed for us to be able to grow, but we're getting that as part of the milk we're getting. So then let's look at highest versus lowest milk intake in men. And what do we find specifically for men? There's a significantly higher 43% increase in prostate cancer mortality. Now, what's fascinating is as a society, we are obsessed with trying to get more and more and more calcium. And the previous talk that I gave for you guys, and I've given all across the country, really is as a country, we're obsessed with calcium and we don't need the calcium. In fact, if you look at how much calcium consumption across the world there is and how that correlates with hip fractures, it's a fascinating correlation. Higher intakes of milk, which is correlating with higher intakes of calcium, the higher amount of hip fractures you see. Now, new 5GC is like that new kid on the block. It's not that new anymore, but what we do know is that basically what happens when you consume it, and it's found in milk, and when you end up consuming it, your body looks at it as foreign. And as it sees it as foreign, it creates this inflammatory response inside the body, and that can be correlated, not causative, but correlated with all sorts of autoimmune stuff. All right, what about oils? So oils also are in the yellow because if you look at some data around olive oil, for example, there's lower mortality, including cardiovascular mortality, stroke goes down. But then you have things like coconut oils, right, which is filled with the bad type of cholesterol. And you find that coconut oil raises things like your LDL, and essentially more than 3/4 of it is really saturated fat. So the data on saturated fat is really interesting. It can be manipulated in all sorts of ways. But once again, saturated fat continues to be something that's not good for us. Now, what we know is that's coconut oil. But what happens if you eat coconuts? Nothing. In fact, coconuts are great. So you should eat coconuts. But whenever we take something and try to take all the goodness out of it, we always run into trouble. Nature has had such a long time to perfect foods for us. It's a symbiotic relationship, right? So the concept was you eat the food, you carry the seed, you spread the seed, and that's how plants survive too. And that's where it's a symbiotic relationship between all sorts of animals and humans and plants. Now, other things like palm oil, for example, when you compare palm oil to soybean or partially hydrogenated soybean oil or olive oil, what you find is that there's no real difference in how much sugar rises in the blood. That doesn't mean that palm oil is good for you. Remember, partially hydrogenated is trans, right? Trans fats we know for a fact are really, really bad for you. Eggs are interesting because if you look at eggs and the risk of dying, there's an interesting study that came out last year that showed there was a 17% higher risk of heart disease. Now, the problem with that study was they only asked the question, how many eggs do you eat, in the beginning of 17-year follow-up. So that makes it very, very difficult to know what's going on. And the interesting part of that study was it's a US-based study. But what happens if you go to Spain, where their lifestyle is so different? They relax more, they have more social connections, they sleep better than us. They're not necessarily chasing material things as much as we are. You find that there really isn't an association. And this is what makes the whole egg argument so confusing. But overall, as part of a healthy thing, when you start to look at these things, the data shows that the green light, which is the foods we mentioned in the beginning, are the ones that have the best value that there is. And that's what you really want to focus on. Now, let's get into alcohol, because this is where no matter who I'm giving the talk to, all of a sudden they give me like these stares. Now, the good thing about doing this on Zoom is nobody can stare back at me. So this is awesome. But alcohol is an interesting thing because the US has the loosest standards when it comes to what is really a safe amount of alcohol to drink. So what's the data? If you look at highest alcohol use with not drinking at all, what you find is that over decades, the hippocampus, which is part of where the memory gets stored, that starts to shrink. And it's really dose dependent, which means the more alcohol you drink, the more shrinkage you get. In fact, if you look at memory recall tests and tests looking at cognitive performance, what you'll find is that there's actually a linear decline. In fact, in this particular study, which is a follow-up of 30 years, which is one of the longest follow-ups we have on any alcohol studies, what we find is that the people who were drinking were actually really, really smart. In fact, they did better than the people who weren't drinking at all. Don't know what that says. But even though they started off being better, if you look at what happened after 20 years or so, they started to get worse. So it doesn't necessarily mean that you can never have alcohol, but if you do it in a way that's safe and you don't go by the US guidelines, because they're very relaxed. We have the loosest guidelines in the world. UK recently changed the guidelines and they made them stricter because of the fact that they felt like what's going on here is way too strict. So if you're drinking, 1 or 2 drinks a week, that's not a big deal. 1 or 2 drinks a day, in my opinion, I think that's a little bit much. Then red light. This is the stuff that's really important to try to minimize. So we covered the greens, we covered the yellows. Now we're going to get into the red. So with the red, as we know, salt continues to be an issue. And once again, whole foods don't have salt. Fast foods have salt. So a really simple way is if you focus on a whole foods plant-based diet, you will never have to worry about getting too much sodium in your diet. Red and processed meat, there's hundreds upon hundreds of studies have shown that as you increase your consumption of red meat, your risk of dying goes up, cancer mortality goes up, total mortality goes up. The same thing applies to processed meat. So if you eat red meat or eat processed meat, your risk of dying from both all-cause cancer and heart disease goes up. Now, as you look at this data, there's a lot of arguments back and forth, but we have study after study showing this. And we know that if you look at the longest living people in the world, they follow a predominantly whole foods plant-based diet. They may not even know what the term is, but that's what the predominant diet is. And if they eat meat, it's a couple of times a month. So then when we look at red meat versus people who don't eat meat, what we find is that the trimethylamine and oxide levels go up as much as 3 times higher. And what they do is TMAO inside the bloodstream is linked to preventing cholesterol from coming back into the liver and increasing cholesterol from going out of the liver and coming out forward. And if you eat meat, it's fascinating. In this particular study, back in 2019, what they showed was it takes 4 weeks for your blood levels of trimethylamine and oxide to return to what they used to be. So after you've been eating meat, you've got about 4 weeks to really get back to a nice baseline. And your gut microbiome can take even longer for it to correct after you give up eating meat. Sugar is interesting because we as a society, meaning American as a society, drink or eat or consume products that have way too much added sugars in them. And so if you get about 10 to 25% of the calories from sugars, your risk of heart disease and leading to death goes up by about 30%. But if you get more than 25% of your calories from added sugars, which a lot of people do, there's a dramatic increase. It's 175% increased risk. And then artificial sweeteners, which once again, this includes all types, including things that we consider natural, whether you're talking about stevia, monk fruit, etc. And what we find here is that if you compare people who use any of the artificial sweeteners or non-sugar sweeteners, what you'll find is that the risk of having extra weight is 47% higher. And if they consume lots of artificial sweetened beverages, their risk of becoming overweight or obese goes up by 93%. And part of that reason, and people always ask, well, why does that happen? It's because when you take something that's 200 times sweeter than sugar, you're going to chase that high. Fruits will not taste as sweet. Nothing will taste as sweet as consuming something that goes anywhere between 200 to 26,000 times as sweet as sugar. That's how sweet some of these artificial sweeteners can be. And then when we look at stroke and dementia, same thing. If you consume more than one artificial sweetened soft drink per day versus none, your risk of stroke goes up quite substantial. Same thing with the risk of dementia. So as you think about these things, anything that says it's 0 calories and all that stuff, listen, if you're going to want something sweet, eat the fruit. If you want to drink something, drink water. Is the best stuff on earth. Now, refined grains are similar because same exact thing. The more you get refined grains, the more your risk of metabolic syndrome. And remember in the beginning, I said with whole grains, you actually get weight loss because a lot of that energy goes out via your stool. And that's some of the beauty of getting whole grains. So you've heard all this stuff. So I just want to share with you a little bit on what is really the bottom line. And this is the same thing I brought up last time, which is once again, eat food, not too much, mostly plants. That's literally it. And just remember, we have such a short amount of time on this world. You can have the perfect diet and not do anything to express gratitude and not be of service to others, and your life will not have meaning. Meaning is about what we share. My work in doing nutrition and giving these talks is simply because I get a chance to change somebody's life. That's my purpose, and that's what gives my life meaning. So I want to thank you guys for your time. I want to turn it back to Chef AJ to see if she has any questions or any thoughts for me.
Wow, thank you so much, Dr. Hashmi. There was a concept that you talked about in this presentation. I have never heard about it. Maybe you could expound on it. Hedonic adaptation.
Yeah, it's the concept is really simple. It's whatever we get used to it, and then we want something else. There's this gentleman who is a scholar and he gives a lot of talks, and he said, if I offered you the moon and you got it, you would want the universe. If I offered you the universe, you would want the next universe. It's this concept that whatever we end up getting, we're not satisfied because we're trying to reach for external things. And satisfaction comes from internal. And so if you can focus on that internal part of you, you will be satisfied exactly where you're at. And that's where when people are so stressed is because they're constantly chasing. What are you chasing? You're never going to have it. It doesn't matter. You can look at, whoever our leaders are today, and they're not satisfied at where they're at. Everybody's chasing. But some of the simplest people I've met across the world are the ones who have so little, and yet they're so incredibly happy. They may not have running water, but they're like, look, we go down to the well, we get water, and guess what? We get to chat and joke, and it's the best thing ever. And they love it. I grew up in Pakistan as a child, and I remember when I was young, every evening you would see everybody just come out of their house, and the streets would be filled with people, and they were all just sitting there to drink tea. That was the thing. It was like this big social experiment where in the entire country, people, that's what they did. They got together and they just shared whatever happened. That's how they lived. And that social interaction was such a big part of it.
Wow. It's kind of like the blue zones, huh?
It's kind of like it is the blues. Yes, absolutely.
Wow. So when you talked about red light, green light, yellow light foods, I've heard a concept similar to that before. And I'm wondering if for some people, the categories could shift a little. I'll give you a couple of examples. You had alcohol in the yellow light. There's probably some people for whom the best amount of alcohol is no alcohol.
Absolutely. Because once again, what the data showed was there wasn't a safe drinking amount. That's what the longest study ever done on alcohol, which is 30 years, showed. And, the difficulty in that is for a lot of people, it's hard for them to make those switches. So when we were looking at this data, we wanted to start with the core. And that's why the green area is your core. Focus on the core. Everything else becomes a little muddy as you get into it, but focus on the core. That's what everything that you do should be built around.
Because one of the things I'm hearing from pretty much everybody I talk to that is in the weight loss space is how important fiber is, not just for its health benefits, but in terms of weight loss, how it fills you up. And things like animal products, alcohol, processed food, there's no fiber in these foods.
Correct. That's absolutely correct, right? And so anytime you're going after stuff that nature really hasn't created for us, and once again, nature had more time to practice than we did. And we should listen to that.
Yeah, I agree. And then even in the green light foods, for example, just because I've worked with so many people for whom nuts are what they call a trigger food, and I know how healthy they are, but I know some people that literally can't moderate and just eat the handful.
And once again, life is all about discipline. And anything, when people ask you at a job interview, they say, what's your strength and what's your weakness? Well, the answer is very simple. Too much of any strength is a weakness, right? So that's where, when you think about all of these things, there's a lot of health benefits to nuts, but nuts are also very calorie dense. So it's very easy if you end up overdoing it. This is why a handful of nuts is the easiest way to go. And if you really can't tell what a handful is, a lot of them come in individual packets, and that can make your life easier too.
Just for some people, when they get a little bit of those richer foods, they want more.
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. And that's the concept of grazing, right? So when we talk about grazing actually leads to weight gain. It does not cause weight loss, because the more you expose your gut to food, the more likely you are to get hungry and end up eating more.
Right. So that the concept of meals is probably a good one for most people.
Yes.
Yeah. So you talked about to focus on the diet that will make you healthy rather than the diet that will make you thin.
Right.
And would 100% whole food plant exclusive diet be one of those diets without the sugar, oil, and salt added?
Well, let's put it this way. Over 1,000 studies would say yes. Not me, but over 1,000 studies would say yes. And you can look at people all across the world and look at the people who live the longest, who live the healthiest, who have the most joy in their life. They're the ones who follow a whole food plant-based diet. They just don't know what it's called.
That's great. You mentioned about sometimes seeing patients that require bariatric surgery. Do they always require it, or is it possible, even at that stage, to implement some of these lifestyle changes where they can maybe avoid that surgery?
So, what ends up happening is you always try lifestyle. In fact, even before surgery, there's a period of time that they have to undergo eating habits and learn, because otherwise, when they come out of surgery, if they try to eat the way they did before, their stomach is so small that they end up vomiting. And they feel like, oh my God, I'm going to die. It's a life-changing experience. But the difficulty is with some people, the things have gotten so bad that if they don't make a change right away, that they feel like there's no control and they may have had very traumatic childhoods and there's so much else going on, that there's really no time for us to be able to work with them to fix all of those issues. We need a solution that works right away. And then with time, we're able to bring them into this better lifestyle. But, the thing about bariatric surgery is you can't just go back and reverse it. It's a life-changing event. So it's not something to be taken lightly. It is an absolute lifelong commitment, and you are stuck with it.
Right. And if a person chooses that route, they can't continue eating the foods that put them in the position in the first place.
And that's the danger. So there are folks that they find ways to be able to still cheat the system and do that, and they can get very, very serious complications. And, anytime we bypass a portion of the intestine, there's all these vitamins that get absorbed in the first part of your small intestine. And once we bypass that, you're going to have vitamin deficiencies for the rest of your life. And you're making a commitment to taking those supplements for the rest of your life. So this is, once again, it's even stronger than a marriage because you cannot get a divorce.
So have you successfully seen any patients that were thinking about that operation but were able to implement lifestyle changes?
We always have success stories in people who are able to avoid surgery simply because they understand. The challenge that we always have as healthcare providers is we have to be able to teach our patients to say there is a better way. No matter how bad you think your life is, no matter how many times you've fallen, you can stand up one more time. You really, really can. And the worst thing about life is if you focus on, I'm going to fall backwards. Don't fall backwards. Fall forwards. At least you're going to know what you're going to hit. You're going to get up, walk forward a couple steps, fall forward, and get up and do it again. This concept of resiliency is something that we're starting to forget as a society. And it's the most powerful concept. We're so used to this idea that everything has to be now, right? I got my Netflix so I can watch the entire series now. Whatever it is, like you name it, it's all about immediate gratification. But life is not immediate. Life is lived. It's the journey. When you die, this part of whatever you have, whatever your faith is, whatever your belief is, this part of your journey ends. And really, this journey is about the journey itself. It's about the relationships and friends and all of those memories we make along the way.
I'm chuckling because what you said about Netflix is so true, Dr. Hashmi. I didn't want to be a subscriber, but now that I am, it's almost impossible to watch a show on regular TV because it's like, you mean I got to wait till next week to see another episode?
I can't. How are you going to watch the commercials? Oh, my goodness. Yes.
I think social media has made that too. They've trained us to want immediacy.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love that, what you said. Don't fall backwards, fall forward. Because so many, really the purpose of this summit is, I don't know if you know my story, but I failed for 52 years. I was obese my entire life. And it wasn't until I was in my early 50s that I finally figured it out. And I know that a lot of people watching this summit have valiantly tried many times and have had ups and downs. And what do you say to the people who pretty much given hope that they could ever be one of your success stories and lose weight?
Every one of us has a story of how difficult we've gone through. And the fact that we're here today and you're listening to this summit or you're watching this summit says you got one more round in you. That's it. That's literally all I would say is if you're here and you're watching this right now and you say, nobody's ever believed in me and I just can't do it. I'm a loser. I'm a failure. If you were, you wouldn't be watching this. What I know about fighters is fighters fight. And if you're watching this, you're a fighter. Go fight.
Wow, I love that. I bet your patients love you. You seem like be so passionate to have as a doctor.
Thank you.
Yeah. So, Dr. Hashmi, what is the real truth about weight loss?
I think the real truth about weight loss in my mindset is focus on real health. Forget the gimmicks, forget everything else. Forget the number on the scale and focus on getting healthy. Look at who you are as a person. Find that in you. Get off this treadmill where you're always chasing after something. Life is beautiful. You are beautiful. If you're looking for weight loss as a way to validate that, you're not going to find it. If you're looking for weight loss because it's coming to you as part of your whole self, that's a beautiful approach, and you're going to get it. So in my mind, the whole truth of weight loss is you focus on health and the weight will follow, right? You focus on shortcuts and you're forgetting. Your body is this beautiful machine. It's this temple. It's the only piece of machinery we know that can adapt to any stress. I don't know if any computer or anything else that'll do that without breaking down. Your body can adapt. You throw so much abuse at it and it adapts. You are a fighter. You are a born fighter. Human beings were born survivors. That's why we managed to be here today. If we weren't born to be survivors, we wouldn't be. So as you think about your future, as you think about your weight loss journey, start with health. I know that deep inside you, there's a fire. There's another round. You just got to be willing to recognize that and step up.
That is beautifully said, and I agree. There's always hope. Thank you so much, Dr. Hashmi.
You're very welcome, and thanks for having me.